A top goalie in the NHL, one of the highest scoring centers in the NHL last year, and now sticking with the Jets long term. To discuss that, here's our NHL analyst, Frankie Corrado. Frankie, how important was it to get not just one, but both Scheifele and Hellebuyck signed long term back in Winnipeg?
It was very important, Gino, if the team wanted to stay in the mix as far as pushing up on the playoffs and being a relevant team. If they were going to go down the path of a rebuild, then surely you could have traded these players and got some pieces for the future, but that's not the road that the Winnipeg Jets wanted to go down. So now they have these two players, key players for their team, their number one center and their number one goaltender, locked up for probably the rest of their careers. And now everyone else in that organization knows exactly which direction this team is headed. They need to stay relevant. They need to compete for a playoff spot. Now it's up to Kevin Cheveldayoff to keep adding pieces that keeps this team in the mix. But you got a commitment from two star players where, we live in a world now where we kind of just assume that star players want to test unrestricted free agency, make as much money as they possibly can. Both these guys have shown that they believe in Winnipeg and they wanted to stay there long term.
There was some serious concern over the summer, especially the fact that they're going into the last year of their contracts. Both of them are, that maybe they look for other options somewhere else. And yet they decided to stay in Winnipeg. Who gets the credit for making this all happen?
Well, listen, any general manager can throw out bags of cash and say, hey, I want to sign you for this much money. But when you want to keep players in your organization, especially when there's been some tumultuous times there, I credit Rick Bowness and the fact that he's come in now and established a certain culture and a certain way of doing things, and he's established certain communication lines. I think that's a big deal for the organization and a big deal for these players. Speaking from a player's perspective, sometimes coaches will say things that you don't necessarily want to hear, but you need to hear. And that stuff can go a long way. And now we've seen with the Winnipeg Jets what Rick Bowness has done as far as, certain things he said in the media. For instance, last year in the playoffs, saying that he was disgusted in his team's effort. You look at that on the surface and think, man, that's nasty stuff. Who wants to hear that kind of stuff? I'll tell you who wants to hear that. Players who want honesty, they respect that kind of communication. And Rick Bowness, I've said it numerous times to you, Gino, you go around the league or guys that have played for him in the past, he gets a very high approval rating from all his players, whether they've been at the assistant coach capacity or a head coach capacity. So I give a lot of credit to Rick Bowness for establishing what it's going to be like to be a Winnipeg Jet and how they're going to conduct themselves on a day-to-day.
Frankie, you mentioned you're a former player in this NHL. It would have been a disaster message sent not only to their fan base, but to the rest of the NHL if you've got two guys who could command this kind of dollars. If they had moved on to somewhere else, it would have been a disaster for this organization, not just this year, for probably years to come. What message does this send to players around the league now that both of these guys are willing to stay in Winnipeg?
Listen, I think there's a certain amount of loyalty that comes with these contracts being signed by two-star players. It would be very easy for them to say that, hey, I did my time in Winnipeg. I was a good soldier. I put up with the cold weather, all that kind of stuff. And now I want to see maybe a warmer climate or somewhere where there's less income tax, for instance. And both these guys have said, listen, I'm okay here. I believe in what we're doing here. And they're going to go down as Winnipeg Jets for their whole careers unless something happens down the road and they get traded. But, I think as far as the rest of the league goes, if you're other general managers, you look at this and you say, Chevy fought tooth and nail to get these guys signed. It would have been very easy for them to look for an exit door. They didn't do that. And now the Winnipeg Jets, whether it's the fans, the players, anyone around the league is looking at this team saying, this is not a team looking to sell off assets. They're not just going to roll over. They've kept two of their star players, and they're going to continue to push on the playoffs and try and improve upon what they did last year, bowing out to the Vegas Golden Knights in the first round.
How much did they increase their possibility to contend very seriously yet again this year?
Listen, this was going to be the roster that they were going into the season with regardless, but now there's no mixed messaging as far as, are these guys going to stay? Are they not going to stay? Is, 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out? These guys are all in. And now as an organization, whether it's the management or the players in the room, you look at that and you say, okay, we know which direction we're going in. These guys are not trying to leave. We're not trying to bring in younger pieces. These guys are going to be here with us. So I think it sends a very important message. The fan base now understands that there's not a big rebuild coming. And I can understand that there may have been some fans that thought it might be time given the circumstances. But if you have an opportunity to re-sign your number one center and your number one goaltender, you have to do it. Look at what Connor Hellebuyck said this summer, Gino. He said he wants to win a Stanley Cup. And a lot of people thought that was his way of saying, I don't think the Winnipeg Jets can do it. I'm going to have to go somewhere else and do it. Well, guess what? Connor Hellebuyck is here to stay in Winnipeg. He must believe that he thinks he can win a Stanley Cup there, and that should be very good news for all the players involved, all the management involved, but most importantly, Gino, the good fans of the Winnipeg Jets.
All right, let me take the other side of this just for a second. These guys are both 30 years old. They've got 1 year left, each of them in their current deal, which means in the 7-year deal, they're going to be 38 before this deal expires. Should Jet fans be concerned of what this contract for both of these guys looks like in year 5, 6, and 7 down the road?
I would say that's a problem for years 5, 6, and 7. Anytime you have a chance to retain high-end talent, you have to do it. And you think about some of the hurdles and obstacles that the Jets franchise has when it comes to recruiting players. Like, not everyone wants to go to Winnipeg. That's a reality. It takes a certain kind of player to want to play there, and these guys have committed there and spent their whole careers there. So that should speak volumes to what they think about the city of Winnipeg and the organization. And the other thing, Gino, like, it's harder to go out and replace talent than it is to retain talent. I would always say this: if you have good people within your organization that you know are good players, sometimes it's worth it dealing with what's going to happen in year 6 and 7 of that contract, and hopefully try and make something happen in the first few years while the players are still relatively in their prime.
Fair enough. Listen, on the release, for the hockey fans that saw this, the Jets headlined the release of the two signings by saying, "Here to stay." Well, given the number of years and number of dollars they've committed to both Hellebuyck and Scheifele, they should change that headline to say, "Here to win," because they need to win now.